Tēnā koutou, haere mai, and welcome to this virtual media conference for APEC Ministers Responsible for Trade, or MRT. Ko Jahan Casanada aho, my name is Jahan Casanada. It's my pleasure to be your MC this evening. Well, in just over an hour, the Ministers responsible for trade from APEC's 21 economies will come together for what is certain to be one of the most important meetings in the APEC calendar. And we're fortunate to have some of those ministers joining us tonight to answer your questions. Ministers, thank you so much for making time in your busy schedules for this media conference. I'd also like to thank the thousands of officials who've been working so hard, meeting virtually at all hours of the day and night in different time zones to get us to this point. Now, in total, those officials have participated in more than 400 hours of virtual meetings already this year. It's a pretty impressive commitment, so thank you. When our trade ministers meet tonight, there is no doubt that COVID will of course be at the top of the agenda. In particular, how do we enable safe and efficient distribution of vaccines? We're also expecting dialogue on how we might position the region for a rapid economic recovery that is both sustainable and inclusive. And I think we can all agree that there has never been a more important time to support APEC's theme, Join, Work, Grow Together.
Throughout COVID-19, APEC has already played a vital role in keeping supply chains for critical goods open and supporting our health and economic response to the pandemic. As we look ahead, our hostia priorities are clear: to champion economic and trade policies that ensure a sustainable and resilient recovery from COVID, to support environmental sustainability and increased inclusion for all, and to pursue innovation in a digitally enabled recovery. But in 2021, our role as host is even more important. Last year, APEC agreed its vision for the next 2 decades. Known as the Putrajaya Vision 2040, it seeks to create an open, dynamic, resilient, and peaceful Asia-Pacific community for the prosperity of all our people and future generations. As host, New Zealand will lead APEC members in setting an implementation plan to deliver on this vision for the next 20 years. It's a big responsibility and an incredible opportunity as we join, work, grow together.
Haumie, huie, tāikie.
Yes, it's a very important conversation. We are really privileged to have you joining us for it this evening. So let me explain how this media conference will work. Shortly, I'll introduce APEC's 2021 MRT Chair, New Zealand's Minister for Trade and Export Growth, Damien O'Connor. Now, Minister O'Connor will preview the discussions that will take place between trade ministers this evening. We'll then have a 30-minute Q&A session. Now, a large number of questions have been submitted prior to this media conference. Thank you very much for getting your questions in advance, and I promise you that we will get to as many of those questions as we can in the time we have available. So if I call on you, please unmute yourself, ask your question, and then mute yourself again. Please be as succinct as possible. To everyone else, please keep your cameras on. It's really great to be able to see you on our screens here in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington. So let's get underway. It's my pleasure to introduce the chair of tonight's MRT meeting, New Zealand's Minister for Trade and Export Growth, Damien O'Connor. Now, Minister O'Connor is one of our longest serving MPs. He was first elected to Parliament in 1993, and he currently holds several key portfolios. As well as being Minister for Trade and Export Growth, he's also New Zealand's Minister of Agriculture, Minister for Biosecurity, Minister for Land Information and Minister for Rural Communities. Minister, you are certainly one of the busiest people in the city. Thanks very much for being here tonight. Over to you for your opening remarks.
Kia ora. No mai, haere mai. Welcome to both my APEC counterparts and members of the media. It's wonderful to have you join us from around the region this evening. I'd like to acknowledge the APEC ministers responsible for trade who have made the time to participate in this virtual media conference. We are navigating an economic and health crisis unparalleled in our lifetimes. COVID-19 is a global problem that demands a cooperative response. As chair of the Ministers responsible for trade meeting, I want to discuss trade's vital role in addressing the most pressing problem our region faces: getting people vaccinated against COVID-19 as quickly as possible. The successful distribution of vaccines across our region will be critical to our recovery. I will be asking my fellow trade ministers how we can speed up the trade in vaccines and other essential goods needed to fight the pandemic. COVID-19 has highlighted once again how much we depend on each other and how important it is to keep trade and supply chains open. We know our region prospers by keeping our markets open, not closing ourselves off. So tonight, trade ministers will discuss how we can rejuvenate the World Trade Organization. We must signal our collective commitment to predictable trade rules that are fair on our businesses. APEC's always provided global leadership in this space, and it is important that we continue to do so. Finally, I want to focus attention on achieving a sustainable economic recovery. We must seek ways to tackle climate change and manage our fisheries better. I know APEC members are committed to confronting these issues at this critical point in time. To that end, I will challenge my fellow trade ministers to reduce subsidies that encourage harmful fishing and unnecessary carbon emissions. I'll also ask what we can do to allow environmental goods to flow more freely. Last night, we held a dialogue between APEC trade ministers and the business leaders of the APEC Business Advisory Council. It was an invaluable opportunity to hear from the private sector. This strong connection with business is a major strength of APEC's work, and their insights will help us lay the foundations for recovery. Together, we can put international trade at the heart of the region's economic rebuild. It will take leadership and innovation to successfully navigate our way through this pandemic. As you can see, we have an ambitious agenda and the choices we make matter. I'm confident APEC economies will stand together during these difficult times. By demonstrating our commitment to free, fair and open trade, we can join, work, grow together. Humie, huie, taikie. Members of the media, we look forward to taking your questions now. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Minister. Thank you very much for your remarks. Thanks for giving us a snapshot of what we can expect in the discussions this evening. So let's make the most of our time. Let's get straight to our media questions, and a reminder to please unmute yourself before asking your question. Our first question comes from Katie Bradford of Television New Zealand. Katie has a question for Minister O'Connor. Kia ora, Katie.
Kia ora, Minister. Just given the supply chain disruptions we've seen globally, what can APEC countries do to try and manage those? And in particular, what can you do to make sure vaccine products can get through faster?
Look, across the APEC economies, we have a challenge of vaccinating almost 3 billion people, and there'll be 5 million doses of vaccine required. We can't, any one of us, do that on our own. We're interdependent on one another to ensure that we can supply the components of the vaccine or the essential goods to support that vaccine supply chain. The interdependency that we have developed across APEC economies has shown incredible performance when it comes to economic output. That cooperation is desperately needed when it comes to vaccines and medical supply equipment. From those lessons, I think we should embed that progress, that cooperation, to ensure that the economic recovery that we all seek beyond COVID-19 can be supported by the supply systems, the supply chains, the learnings and the technology that we will develop hopefully very quickly over the next 12 months as we work through the acute issues of COVID, but into a better future.
Excellent. Thank you, Minister. We have another question for you. This one comes from Neil Sands from AFP. Neil, please unmute and ask your question.
Okay, kia ora. I just wanted to check, you talked about global cooperation and the rollout of vaccines. Germany has come out very, very strongly against a patent waiver for vaccines. How much of a hindrance is that going to be to speeding up the global rollout, and is there an alternative plan to ramp up a vaccination effort?
Look, these are extraordinary times, and they will require extraordinary actions, and the waiver, the TRIPS waiver that's been required, is perhaps some of the things that will be necessary. We believe that there are other challenges that we can address, the production of vaccine itself, the distribution of it, and making sure that the components of the vaccine are moved quickly across borders, and that we distribute the vaccine we have to the people who need it. The TRIPS waiver application, which New Zealand has always supported in principle, will require consensus at the WTO. We welcomed the US's announcement that they would support that direction, and so we will continue to support whatever is necessary to ensure that actually everyone across the globe has access to a vaccine. So the TRIPS waiver in of itself won't solve the challenge of getting everyone vaccinated, but these are extraordinary times, and the extraordinary action that may be necessary to implement that will be decided ultimately through consensus at the WTO. New Zealand has supported that, and we welcome other economies coming on and supporting us as well.
Thank you, Minister. We'll move on now to our next question. This one comes from Wei Wang from China Global Television Network. The question is going to be directed to Minister Wang from China. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Well, currently the COVID-19 pandemic is spreading globally, and under the current circumstances, the open market and the secure and the stabilized global and regional industrial and supply chains are particularly important for responding to the economic impact of the pandemic. So my question goes to Mr. Wang Wentao from China. So what measures has China taken to further open up to global markets during this time? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. As you said, the pandemic has had a serious impact on the global and AP economies, and has also brought unprecedented challenges to China's economic and social development. President Xi Jinping has repeatedly stressed that opening up is China's basic national policy, and that China will open its door wider and will not change this policy at any time. In the face of the pandemic, instead of stopping its opening up process, China has launched a series of policy measures to open up further. I'd like to briefly introduce you to these measures here. First, China has expanded further market access. China revised the negative lists for foreign investment access, reducing the number of restrictive measures on the negative lists to 33 and 30 in the national and pilot free trade zones, respectively, and further compressing the negative list for the free trade port to 27 measures. New comprehensive pilots for expanding opening up of the service sector were established in Tianjin, Shanghai, Hainan, and Chongqing. The national comprehensive demonstration area for expanding opening up of the service sector is being developed in Beijing, and foreign investment access has been widened in such sectors as finance, culture, education, and so on. With routine COVID prevention and control measures in place, the third China International Import Expo, the China International Fair for Trading Services 2020, and the first Consumer Product Expo were successfully held. China established 10 import trade promotion innovation demonstration zones to promote the expansion of imports for advanced technologies, equipment, and services. Second, China's continued to strengthen institutions and optimize the business environment. A general plan for the development of the free trade port in Hainan was issued, and 3 new free trade pilot zones were established in Beijing, Hunan, and Anhui, further strengthening reform and opening up initiatives. The foreign investment law and its implementing regulations were fully implemented, and 23 administrative regulations that were inconsistent with the foreign investment law were amended or repealed. China revised the trademark law and the patent law to increase the protection of intellectual property rights. China adjusted the catalogue of prohibited goods for processing trade in order to create more market space for business. China enhanced the level of customs clearance facilitation and reduced the overall customs clearance time for imports and exports. We have talked about the importance of customs clearance facilitation. And then the overall customs clearance time for imports and exports actually were reduced by 64% and 86% respectively in 2020 as compared to 2017. Third, China has actively participated in and promoted regional free trade arrangements. China is implementing an FTA upgrading strategy and is committed to further improving the level of regional trade and investment liberalization and facilitation and promoting regional economic integration. China took the lead in completing the ratification process for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and is favorably considering joining the CPTPP. And these efforts will ultimately contribute to the realization of an FTA-AP. In a short while, we will convene this year's APEC Ministers for Trade responsible for trade meeting to discuss initiatives to address the pandemic and support the multilateral trading system. China is ready to work with other economies to push for the success of the meeting and send a positive signal to the international community that the AP region is working together to fight COVID, to keep regional supply chains stable, and to promote regional economic recovery. China will also speed up the building of a new development paradigm, promote opening up at higher levels, and create more opportunities for global and regional development. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Wang. Much appreciated. On to our next question now, which comes from Elaine Kurtenbach from the Associated Press. This question will be directed to State Minister Washio from Japan. Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello, thank you for to join. I was going to ask what specifically the APEC trade ministers view as specifically needed to build back better after the pandemic, to create a more sustainable, more equitable, and more healthy future for the region. Thank you.
Thank
you very much indeed. First, key to a post-pandemic economic recovery is green and digital. To build back better, varied and realistic energy transitions to a carbon neutral society with green growth should be promoted, taking into account specific conditions of each economy. As the pandemic is accelerating digitalization, a global rule for a digital society is needed. DFFT, that is data free flow with trust, needs to be realized sooner than later. And second, to build back better, measures to support women and micro and small and medium enterprises should be taken who have been severely affected by the pandemic. Inclusive measures are urgently needed to ensure that no one is left behind, embracing the principle of human society. So green growth and digital technologies provide valuable opportunities for inclusive measures, as we discussed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that response. Arya Sindiara from Antara in Indonesia, who has a question for Minister Lutfi from Indonesia.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Pak Lutfi, my question is that the theme of this year's APEC MRT meeting is to find common ground on environmental issues in the economic recovery and to send a strong signal of support for multilateral trading system. How can Indonesia play a role in this multilateral effort and at the same time ensuring that there is also focus on restoring the national economy as well as focus on handling the pandemic in the country? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we are contemplating that this green recovery as a part of a momentum. So the economic recovery in Indonesia also will bring good cohesive plan. So Indonesia will also be responsible for the environment. We are a party to the Paris Agreement. We are committed to our cutting off the greenhouse gases emissions, but at the same time, we're also looking for the opportunity for green recovery in this, per se, to have also a good, clean development for the future. This is part of our responsibility. We put this as part of transformations, not only on the Indonesia's economy, because of the opportunity of green economy is there, it's also part of the responsibility as the world. We would like to have a better environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. We will move on now to our next question. This one comes from Lewis Ong from Lian Ha Zaobao. This is a question for Minister O'Connor. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Are there any updates on APEC's economy support for vaccine multilateralism and the fair and equitable access to diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines?
I think, each of our economies has been committed to the huge challenge of COVID-19. Mindful, of course, is that vaccines are the front line of defence and that we have to roll those out. We are mindful that access to services, access to medical equipment is just as important. And so as trade ministers for those economies, we have to make sure that there are no unfair barriers or logistics problems as that rolls out. And I think we're learning as we go forward as to how better manage that. The commitment that APEC economies made last year to minimise the barriers will be followed through. But as we have, I guess, the emergence of new variants and new challenges, we have to make sure that the latest technology, the latest updates in terms of vaccines, if necessary, get rolled through to the people of our economies and actually to the wider globe, because until each one of us is safe as an economy, then none of us can enjoy any of the benefits of progress from COVID.
Thank you, Minister O'Connor. I understand that we have Minister Tian back online now, so let's replay that pre-recorded question we had earlier from Jonathan Kernsley from 9 News in Australia.
Minister Tian, it's Jonathan Kersley from 9 News. This question is for you and other APEC trade ministers. Given the sanctions and trade impositions that China has placed on Australian produce over the last 12 months, what, if any, discussion has there been with other APEC member states about the risk posed by a rising China in terms of needing to diversify trade interests across the region?
Thank you, Jonathan, and that's a really interesting question. And normally when APEC is meeting in person, there is the ability for us to be able to talk in the margins of these conferences about these types of issues. Obviously, a meeting virtually, that's a little bit more difficult, but one of the really important things that is coming out of this APEC meeting is a very clear reaffirmation of the importance of the World Trade Organization, the importance of the global trading rules and making sure that everyone adheres to them. And it's very important, the statement that we've got out of the ministerial meeting tonight, to see that there is a very clear statement which supports the global trading rules and everyone making sure that those global trading rules are adhered to. And so we'll continue this dialogue. Obviously, we continue to use direct representations at officials level on our current dispute with China. And also we have begun a process of dispute settlement through the World Trade Organization on barley, and we're considering what we'll do when it comes to wine. But one of the things that I'd love to be able to do is for all the trade ministers to be in New Zealand in person, so at least in the margins of the conference we would be able to talk about some of these issues. But thanks very much for your question.
Minister Tian, thanks for your answer, and please stay with us because we have another pre-recorded question for you. This one comes from Andrew Tillett from the Australian Financial Review.
You obviously got reform of the WTO on the agenda as one of the items of discussion. I was just wondering what your assessment is of the prospect of actually getting reform happening this year, given that there's seems to be a lot of momentum with other multilateral bodies and individual countries, especially the need for the WTO reform. And what can actually be achieved this year in light of that?
Look, I'm very confident that we can get a very good outcome at the ministerial meeting at the end of the year at the WTO. We've seen the new Director General, Ngozi, hit the ground running and really build momentum for us to be able to get meaningful outcomes at the ministerial meeting at the end of the year. We're seeing very important work taking place on fisheries subsidies at the moment, and hopefully the ministerial meeting in July will be able to get an outcome on fisheries subsidies. There's also very important work taking place with regards to trade in health, and the Ottawa Group met 2 weeks ago to progress that agenda. From an Australian point of view and a Cairns Group point of view, there's important work taking place when it comes to agriculture and in particular when it comes to domestic subsidies. So I think there is real momentum building important new areas like e-commerce and digital trade. There are also a lot of countries working together to see whether we can get an outcome in that regard, and hopefully we'll be able to give a very strong update as to how far that work's progressed at MC12. So very important work being undertaken, and I think we can get the reform we need.
Excellent. Minister Tian, thank you very much for that. Let's come back to Minister O'Connor here in Wellington. We have a question for you, Minister, from Sonali Paul from Reuters. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Minister O'Connor, thanks for your time. Do you see any issues around the intellectual property waiver from the WTO point of view standing in the way of what you're trying to achieve here? And how are you going to get over that challenge?
Clearly, a decision at the WTO must be a consensus one. We're very mindful that the development of intellectual property that's enabled us to very quickly get vaccines developed in a time we haven't seen previously across the globe, really. We have to respect that intellectual property. So a TRIPS waiver or waiver of that, has to be considered carefully. But it is, as I said before, extraordinary times. We believe if there are clearly barriers to the rollout of vaccine to people caused by IP, then we should seek a waiver. We believe that there are still some other challenges around logistics, around production. We can maybe ramp that up and ensuring that we have the systems in place within all the economies and countries around the world that allows the vaccines to be distributed. So having looked at all of those challenges, if it is IP indeed that is holding us back, I think there will be consensus reached at the WTO. And I think as APEC economies, we're certainly going to ask for that to be considered seriously.
Minister, we've talked a lot about COVID-19 this evening, but what about the responsibilities that APEC economies have to deal with some of those longer-term challenges like climate change and the environment?
Well, I think everything that we've talked about in the lead-up to this meeting has a commitment to inclusive development, to sustainable development, not through COVID but beyond COVID. And I think we are facing up to the challenges of COVID now, but we're not setting aside the obvious one of climate change as we move forward. And I think that realisation and what we've done through cooperation to take on COVID, we can share in wisdom and in practice as we take on climate change. So I think we've built some momentum here from APEC, and I think we can follow that through to WTO to ensure that environmental goods and services are considered carefully, so we remove the barriers to the free flow of those between economies. These are areas, as I say, along with inclusiveness, consideration for Indigenous peoples, those are areas that will build back better. And I think of the opportunity of a crisis, of course, that we're all facing, but we shouldn't waste those opportunities.
Yeah, and you mentioned those opportunities. What do you think the opportunity is for APEC economies as we lean into those difficult issues?
Well, I think as 21 economies that have shown in the past that through cooperation, through the lowering of trade barriers, we can achieve a huge amount. 1 billion people out of poverty, life expectancy increased, access to water and to education has increased, and the economic growth in this region has outstripped that of any other regions across the globe. So that cooperation and the lowering of barriers between our countries and our economies, I think, has proven that we can do this and we can show others around the world.
We have a question here for Ambassador Tai. Before I ask that question, I just want to check whether Ambassador Tai can hear us. Ambassador, could you please unmute yourself and say hello if you can?
Thank you. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Right. Thank you very much. Let's go to our question. This one comes from James Mager from Bloomberg. Please ask your question for Ambassador Tai.
Hi, Ambassador Tai. The trade tariffs that China and the US impose on each other are outside the rules-based multilateral system, as is the Phase 1 trade deal, which has been criticized as encouraging managed trade, which would damage the positions of other nations. Will you be continuing with this trade deal and tariffs, especially as you look towards reforming of the WTO? And should any future trade deals with China go through the WTO? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. The U.S.-China trade relationship is one of the most important in the world. It is the trade relationship between the two largest economies in the world, and therefore it is important not just for the United States and China, but for all players in the global economy. I want to say a few words about this particular relationship, separate from how important it is, which is it is a relationship in trade that has been marked by significant imbalance. That is in terms of performance, but also in terms of opportunity and openness of our markets to each other. In light of this significant imbalance, I would say that there are parts of this trade relationship that are unhealthy and have over time been damaging in some very important ways to the US economy. I want to take a moment also to address the WTO part of your question, which is as we look at the WTO as an institution, we also see imbalance in the WTO in terms of, for example, the functioning of its two main components, its negotiating function and also its dispute settlement function, which has over time become a very, very powerful and overbearing litigation function, which has undermined the vitality of its negotiations function. In both cases, what I would like to make clear is the United States is committed to doing everything we can to bring balance back to the US-China trade relationship and also to bring balance back to the WTO in terms of reforming and revitalizing the WTO. These will be primary, very important focuses of our administration's work because the rebalancing is going to be critical to the strength and healthiness of the US economy, but more broadly to the world economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai, and please stay with us. We have a second question for you. Let's go back to Sonali Paul from Reuters now. Sonali, please ask your question for Ambassador Tai.
Ambassador Tai, thanks for your time. We wanted to find out if you could give us a sort of a progress report on how talks are going on the intellectual property waiver at the WTO. And also, do you see the potential outcome of this meeting at the APEC Trade Ministers meeting potentially undermining efforts on the WTO front on the IP waiver issues or even on vaccine issues?
I'd be happy to answer the first part of your question, but I just want to pause for a moment and say I don't quite understand the second part of your question in terms of the undermining piece, if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit.
I'm just thinking, is it possible that maybe the outcome of this meeting you might have some countries within APEC sort of happy with the outcome and then not willing to support an IP waiver?
Well,
in terms of access to vaccines.
With respect to the TRIPS waiver at the WTO, let me just answer the first part of your question. I'll move on to the second part of your question. We're actually really encouraged to see more WTO members come forth with proposals on what they can support at the WTO with respect to intellectual property rules at the WTO and how they apply to the COVID vaccines. That applies both to the revision of the original proposal by the proponents of the waiver, but also, for example, by the European Union coming forward with principles to guide how they would like to engage on this issue at the WTO. We are encouraging more WTO members to come forward in this process. And we are carefully reviewing the proposals, as I'm sure all WTO members are right now, and looking forward to moving the WTO's membership to text-based negotiations. With respect to undermining or not undermining, what I've heard from these few days of interaction with my fellow ministers from the APEC region is broadly an agreement that we need to increase access to vaccines, increase supply of vaccines, and that we are all committed to bringing each other through this pandemic so that we can get on with the work of revitalizing our economies, recovery for the world, and also bringing hope and future planning back to the lives of all of our individual citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tai, and a big thank you to all of our ministers for joining us for this media conference this evening. That brings us to the end of the media conference. The participation of our ministers, of course, clearly illustrates the cooperation that APEC is known for. We're really looking forward to seeing how you progress these important conversations at this evening's meeting. Thank you also to our members of the media. Look, there are 11 time zones across the APEC region, and that definitely brings its challenges. We appreciate your involvement and your input. Thank you for taking the time to participate. A full pack of media materials, including information on the meeting outcomes, will be sent to you at the end of the MRT meeting. Thank you, Minister O'Connor, for your time. Good to see you again. And to all of you joining us from around the region, mā te wā, see you all soon.
Kia ora. I'm Jaden from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kia ora is a Māori word for saying hello, down here in the economy that is lucky enough to be hosting APEC 2021. Just not actually down here. Like you, we were ready to welcome everyone to our homes, to give representatives of all 21 APEC economies a taste of who we are. But also like you, we are determined to support the global COVID response. And that's why you're viewing us like this, virtually. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome to your virtual introduction to Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are people of open hearts, where you will be welcomed as part of a community that believes in bringing people together. This is how we will all join together. We are people of open minds, where different views are shared and supported, and hard work and teamwork is encouraged. This is how we will all work together, all the while embracing and leading technology that helps push the world forward positively and without limits. Boats that fly, what's next? Whoa! This is how we will all grow together. Join, work, grow together. Haumie, hui e, tai ki e.